for his views on this.
My Lords, I begin by welcoming the comments in the maiden speech of the Noble Lord Lord Harlech about the urgency of the climate emergency, and note how we're seeing a real change in the balance of the benches opposite as more new and younger members join them. I hope that will have an influence on the government and indeed perhaps particularly the Treasury. I thank the Noble Lady Baroness Young of Oldscone for securing this absolutely crucial debate and for her very clear, informative and powerful introduction to it. As she and a number of other speakers have noted, Wales, Scotland and Ireland already have land use strategies. We often hear from the government how we're world leading. Here we're obviously trailing even on these islands. And I think if we're thinking about both a land use framework and more broadly how we have regulation and management of our land, there's really three sides to this triangle, logically enough. One of which is to have a strategy, an approach and a plan of how we use land. Another is to encourage good use of the land, and that's something that what we mostly hear from the government benches opposite, talking about the Sustainable Farm Initiative, the local nature recovery and the landscape recovery schemes, all of which come under the ELMS banner. But the reality of those is they're all voluntary. They're all things to which people can enlist. But we really don't know in these trial schemes how many people, how many landowners are going to enlist. What we hear a great deal less of, and something we undoubtedly need to hear a great deal more of, is how we actually stop deeply detrimental, disastrous land uses and management. And here the Noble Lord Whitty referred to pesticides, referred to the problem of nitrogen and phosphate runoff, something that's really scarring our rivers and oceans and that we're really seeing an impact of, and indeed a great deal of public concern about. So what we need is we need a strategy, we need to stop doing the things we shouldn't be doing, and we need to encourage the things that we should be doing. And that should be the overall pattern of how the government is approaching this. Now, just picking up a couple of the points that have been raised, I very much agree with the Noble Lady Baroness Thornhill. A very good question, why not a national strategy? But I would disagree with some of the comments she made about local management, local decision making. We have a Greenbelt strategy, a national strategy, and we also have lots of communities who are very desperate to defend their communities, to defend their green spaces. And I think I would say that there are many communities, and I've visited quite a few of them, who have good cause to question new quote-unquote executive housing being built going into a very doubtful market, going into that won't feed into the communities, won't be part of the communities. And I'm thinking here particularly of visiting a greenfield site, a greenbelt site in Sunderland, where this is at that time anyway was the only city in England that was losing population. Yet here was a hugely valued, hugely used by the public patch of green land that was going to see executive homes built on it for people to actually commute along the motorway to work in other cities. And I don't believe that is a good use of valuable land. Now, I think it really is worth looking and trying to learn from what has been done elsewhere on these islands. And of course in Scotland, as a number of local noble lords have referred to, they've had two land use strategies since the Climate Change Act came into force in 2009 there. They brought in a vision of sustainable land use, objectives and principles for deciding decision-making. And I think that's what the Noble Lady Baroness Young of Oldscone very much made clear, that this is not saying we're going to allocate every piece of land to be used in a certain way. It sets out certain principles. And I want to say, first of all, that I agree, I think, pretty well with every word that the Noble Lady Baroness Boycott said in terms of the issues of food production, and particularly healthy food production. I'd want to add to that a little by looking at what's happening in Scotland, where there is a land rights and responsibility statement, which is taking a human rights-based approach to land use. And I think this is talking about the relationship between the people and the land. And this is something that I don't think any noble lord has really addressed yet. Now, I'm sure the noble lord, the minister, will be delighted to know that should he be looking towards developing a land use strategy, Green Party conference, having just been held last weekend, actually was considering a draft land use strategy, an entire new chapter for the Policies for Sustainable Society. And I'd be delighted to share with the noble lord, the minister, the draft plans there, which set out far more than I have time to today to talk about our vision for land. But one of the things that I really want to focus on in that is the way we use the land needs to address what I might say is the other pressing issue. The maiden speech of the noble Lord Harlech focused on climate. Many other noble lords have focused on the issues of biodiversity, the state of nature. I want to focus on the issues of poverty and inequality and how we need to see a land use strategy that actually tackles those. And this is where something else we were talking about at Green Party conference, the issue of right to roam. And the noble Lady Baroness Young of Old Scone in her introduction talked about how there's multiple pressures. We need about 130% of the land use, of the land we actually have for all the uses we need it for. Well, one of the answers to this is that is very clearly multiple uses. And of course, using land to grow food, or using land indeed to store carbon or for nature, but that is also available to recreation, to public use, is one way in which we can double our availability of the use of the land. That's a way in which the Scottish approach really does look forward. I think looking to Wales, and a number of noble lords have already referred to this, the approach that's driven by the Future Generations Act there, something that noble Lord Bird has very clearly been championing in your lordship's house, and I think we've seen a great deal of support for. If we look to that and think about managing our land in ways that improves it for the future, and that's where we come back particularly to the state of nature, but also if we're thinking about the human rights approach to improving the health and well-being of our population. And that's where we come to issues not just of recreation, of access to land that we know is so crucial to human health and well-being, but also to thinking about what kind of crops we're growing on that land. And this is where I would, to some degree, take issue with the comments of the noble Lord Carrington. The idea that arable land, what we need to do is grow the kind of crops that we're growing on it now. And just to take one example, we have a large amount of some of our very best land is devoted to producing sugar beet. That's despite the fact that we actually consume vastly more sugar than we should be eating for public health and well-being. If we were growing fruit and vegetables on that land, in perhaps a mixed system that was also managed in ways that were excellent for biodiversity and for nature, then what we would be seeing would be a human rights approach, a nature-based approach, an approach of land use that all fits together. And this comes back really to the question of how we think about the ownership of land. And again, I refer back to the Green Party draft strategy. And it talks about people in control of land being the stewards of that land. And that is an approach that I believe we really need to take forward to advance. It needs to be managed for the common good. That means profits can be made, certainly, returns can be taken off, but we need to see all of our land use managed under a strategy that works for the common good. And finally, just to come back to the point that the noble lord was suggesting about the issues of energy generation, and this is actually one of the great practical debates that we're seeing now, issue particularly of solar farms being put potentially on arable land, issues of biofuel crops, and I have great concerns about those issues. But it is worth looking at the history here, that if you go back about 150 years, about a third of our arable land was actually used for energy production. It grew hay and oats, producing very literally horsepower. So what we need is a land use strategy. We need rules that stop damaging use of land. We need elms, those systems to be encouraging positive use of land. That's really quite a challenge for the government to fit those three sides of the triangle together into something that really works for people and to nature. But that's the challenge that we need a land use strategy to cater to.